Before we begin reading, I do want to say next week, for those of you who desire to read ahead, 2 Samuel chapters 5 and 6 is where we're going to be. It's the part of the story of David. Obviously not the whole of the story of David, but very small part. So this morning, I want to begin by reading in chapter 1 of 1 Samuel. And then we're going to read a couple of verses in chapter 2, and then several verses in chapter 3. Let's begin this morning in verse 1. The word of the Lord. There was a man named Elkanah who lived in Ramah, in the region of Suf, in the hill country of Ephraim. He was the son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, son of Ephraim. Elkanah had two wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah did not. Each year, Elkanah would travel to Shiloh to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of heaven's armies at the tabernacle. The priests of the Lord at that time were the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas. On the days Elkanah presented his sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to Peninnah and each of her children. And though he loved Hannah, he would give her only one choice portion because the Lord had given her no children. Now, I want to pause here real quick, because some of your translations may say a double portion, and you may be thinking, he's not reading the Bible. Well, I am. The difficulty is the Hebrew is very difficult to translate there. Some translators take it as a double portion because he loved Hannah very clearly. Others take it as only a single portion because of her status. The question is the truth is we don't really know how much portion she was getting. So a double or single, it doesn't really matter. The plight of Hannah becomes clear in the story, in the setting of the story. Verse 6. So Peninnah would taunt Hannah and make fun of her because the Lord had kept her from having children. Year after year, it was the same. Peninnah would taunt Hannah as they went to the tabernacle. Each time, Hannah would be reduced to tears and would not even eat. Why are you crying, Hannah? Elkanah would ask. Why aren't you eating? Why be downhearted just because you have no children? You have me. Isn't that better than having 10 sons? We're going to come to his foolishness here in a little bit. Let's move on and read from verse 9 first. Once after a sacrificial meal at Shiloh, Hannah got up and went to pray. Eli the priest was sitting at his customary place beside the entrance of the tabernacle. Hannah was in deep anguish, crying bitterly as she prayed to the Lord. Is it out? I thought so. Here, I'm going to let you do it again. One of these days, we won't ever have any microphone troubles or computer troubles or anything. And you all laugh because you know it's not true. Okay. Let's pick back up in verse 9 there. Once, after a sacrificial meal at Shiloh, Hannah got up and went to pray. Eli the priest was sitting at his customary place beside the entrance of the tabernacle. Hannah was in deep anguish, crying bitterly as she prayed to the Lord. And she made this vow, O Lord of heaven's armies, if you will look upon my sorrow and answer my prayer and give me a son, I will give him back to you. He will be yours for his entire lifetime, and as a sign that he has been dedicated to the Lord, his hair will never be cut. As she was praying to the Lord, Eli watched her. Seeing her lips moving but hearing no sound, he thought she had been drinking. Must you come here drunk? He demanded. Throw away your wine. Oh, no, sir, she replied. I haven't been drinking wine or anything stronger, but I am very discouraged, and I was pouring out my heart to the Lord. Don't think I am a wicked woman, for I have been praying out of great anguish and sorrow. In that case, Eli said, go in peace. May the God of Israel grant the request you have asked of him. Oh, thank you, sir, she exclaimed. And she went back and began to eat again, and she was no longer sad. The entire family got up early the next morning and went to worship the Lord once more. Then they returned home to Ramah. When Elkanah slept with Hannah, the Lord remembered her plea, and in due time she gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, for she said, I asked the Lord for him. Chapter 2, verses 11 and 26 read, Then Elkanah returned home to Ramah without Samuel, so they had returned and left him there. And the boy served the Lord by assisting Eli, the priest. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew taller and grew in favor with the Lord and with the people. And then chapter 3, the first 10 verses. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel served the Lord by assisting Eli. Now in those days, messages from the Lord were very rare, and visions were quite uncommon. One night Eli, who was almost blind by now, had gone to bed. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was sleeping in the tabernacle near the ark of God. Suddenly the Lord called out, Samuel. Yes, Samuel replied, What is it? He got up and ran to Eli. Here I am. Did you call me? I didn't call you, Eli said. Go back to bed. So he did. Then the Lord called out again, Samuel. And again Samuel got up and went to Eli. Here I am. Did you call me? I didn't call you, my son. Eli said, Go back to bed. Samuel did not yet know the Lord because he had never had a message from the Lord before. So the Lord called a third time. And once more Samuel got up and went to Eli. Here I am. Did you call me? Then Eli realized it was the Lord who was calling the boy. So he said to Samuel, Go and lie down again. And if someone calls again, say, Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. So Samuel went back to bed. And the Lord came and called as before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel replied, Speak, your servant is listening. I really love this story. This is one of my favorites. Hannah is one of my favorite characters in the Old Testament. So I want to dive right in here. Because see, it was the best of times, but not really. It was the worst of times, definitely. Because if you know anything about the time of Judges, which of course Samuel follows directly on the heels of that, as Samuel himself is the final judge, would you characterize the time of the Judges as the best of times or the worst of times? The worst of times, right? And if you don't think that, just go read Judges, okay? And come back to me next week and we'll talk about just how really the worst of times it actually was. So let's talk about what was going on during this period of Israel's history. There's a lot of historical setting to set up here for the story of Hannah and Samuel, for Eli and Elkanah. Way too much for me to give truly, ample details to cover it all. But a few, I think, are particularly important. So we left off the story of God last week when the Israelites are poised to enter the promised land, right? There's so much ahead of them, so much promise, so much future, so much good that can come from this people if they will only cross over and follow the word of the Lord. And we saw some of those instructions last week, right? When we read the Ten Commandments. We talked about the different instructions from Deuteronomy chapter 6 that Moses gives to the people, how they're supposed to pass along their faith, pass along those traditions to their children and grandchildren. If you know anything about the time of the Judges, that didn't happen. Thus, we have the worst of times. If you read the book of Judges in the Hebrew Bible, there's a recurring phrase over and over again, that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And so this cycle of following God under the leadership of one person, falling away and coming back to follow God again, continued over and over again through this period of history. And the theme of eyesight, coincidentally, is going to be very important in this story as it was in the time of Judges because the people couldn't see clearly. They had lost their vision. They had lost their focus on God. And we see that very clearly here with Eli and with his own sons. What the writer of Judges was communicating is that the people had failed in the charge that Moses had given to them. Moses emphasized that the covenant was with this new generation, and was going to be with all the generations to come, if only they would hold up their end of the bargain. But of course, the people quickly turned aside. And so we find ourselves arriving at the story of Hannah here and of Samuel, with so much history there in between that we just don't have time to talk about. But that leads us to talking about Elkanah and Hannah here in just a little bit. Because you see, his family lineage plays into this as well. Along with that broader Israelite context, there is a historical context here that's directly pertinent to this story, and that is of Elkanah himself. In the first few verses that we read there of chapter 1, we're actually given a brief history of Elkanah, the family lineage that he comes from himself, or at least a portion of it. And that's immensely important to any Israelite. The same as it's important to us, right? Have any of you ever done any genealogical work or had a relative who did? Most of us find those stories really fascinating, don't we? We enjoy hearing those stories about our grandparents and our great-grandparents. Maybe if they immigrated from another country, right, and moved here under some great turmoil, or even if they didn't. I mean, there's so much history, even in our own families. That's what the writer here of Samuel is trying to communicate about Elkanah and his family. But it further highlights the difficulty and the despair that Hannah feels that we're supposed to sympathize with. What we're setting up here is that he clearly has a past, right? We know his family lineage, but through Hannah, he has no future. So the contrast is very stark here. The writer is setting up. He gives a couple of verses of, look at this man's history. His family is so important. And so the letdown is all the greater because Hannah cannot have children. At least not yet. And this, to me, leads into kind of a broader discussion of infertility and how it's understood both within Scripture and without that I want to have here for just a minute. There's no doubt, when you read the Bible, children, having children, raising children are incredibly important to the people of Israel. All you have to do is go read the Bible, and you're going to see that. The same is true in our own modern context. Raising children is still seen as incredibly important. But of course, in Scripture, there's given that added note to it of children are a blessing from God. Now, we can debate whether that's true or not. At least at some times. I know you parents are agreeing with me. Because some of you parents are thinking, yeah, and now my kids are experiencing that with my grandchildren. Every Scripture about children is viewed positively in the Hebrew Bible. And there's a reason for that. Children are a blessing. Now, some could easily claim that that's true because the majority of the people at that time, they live in an agrarian society, right? One where they're having to cultivate the land, work the land. They would often have big plots of land that they needed to work. That's difficult for one person or even two people to do. So children are seen as really kind of labor, right? A labor force, if you will. So it was important to have lots of children. It was also important to have lots of children because infant and children mortality rates were much higher than they are now, right? So raising a large family was seen as some kind of, as a blessing from God. And that is undoubtedly true. I'm not going to disagree with that. At the same time, it would be wrong to think that having children makes a person whole. And this is where I want to go this morning by talking about this. The way that we talk about marriage, the way that we talk about having children, is almost as if a person never accomplishes those things, that person cannot be complete or whole in God. And I think often the church has done a disservice to singles and to childless married couples who are unable to have children. It's really been a sort of stain on the church that we have not addressed these issues more appropriately. And look, I am happily married. I am happily a father, contrary to what some of you think about me. I am happily a father, most of the time. But if I were without children, if I were single, I could absolutely live a fulfilled and happy and complete and whole life in God without being married and without having children. But the way that we talk about it in the church doesn't seem like that sometimes. I mean, how many of us are quick to, somebody comes home from college, hey, did you meet anybody yet? You ready to get married yet? We send our kids to Christian colleges so that they'll find spouses. And look, I'm all for my children growing up and having a good spouse. But if it doesn't happen, does that make them less of a person in God? Does that mean that they're not complete or whole in their own life because they never get married or don't have children? We have got to reframe the way that we talk about singleness and the way that we talk about childlessness. Because sometimes the language that we use is that a person can only be complete, a person can only be blessed if they get married and have children. And folks, that's just not true scripturally. And so for the people that we know in our lives who year after year after year prayed for a child and never got one, what message does the church have for them? Sorry, God's cursed you in some way? You're just not as special as we are because we got to have 3 kids? That can't be the message that we send to people. And if it is, then the church is failing in our duty to raise up people as being true image bearers without all these other things tacked on. Because you see, that idea that a person can only be complete by being married or having children is nowhere found in Scripture. Nowhere in Scripture is that found. In fact, Paul himself admonishes the Corinthians to stay single if they can. He says it's better off for you if you're single, because then you're not divided in your loyalty. If you get married, you're suddenly going to be facing a choice. Man, I got to spend more time with my spouse, or what am I supposed to be doing for the Lord? When you add children into that, how much time did children suck away from us? A bunch, right? We're constantly engaged in doing things for our kids. We need a better sense of self-worth than marriage and parenting provide. Getting married, having children, doesn't solve feelings of self-doubt. Getting married and having children doesn't take away your insecurities. We think it does sometimes. Getting married and having children doesn't solve loneliness. I know plenty of married people, plenty of people who have children who feel just as lonely as they ever did. We have to have a better sense of completeness and wholeness in the Lord than by getting married and having children. And the sooner we understand that, the better. The sooner we understand that, the sooner singles are going to feel more at home in the church. A place where they absolutely belong. The sooner we understand that, the sooner childless couples are going to feel more at home in the church. Again, a place that they absolutely belong. I want to close today by talking about Hannah and Samuel. It's difficult for me to speak on Hannah's behalf because I'm not a woman and I never bore a child. Nor did I ever have to pray about being barren and trying to get pregnant. But I have certainly faced my own frustrations and pains in life, right? There is a sense in which I resonate with her story because my life hasn't been pain-free. My life hasn't been frustration-free. I've had people make fun of me and put me down and feel insecure about those things and not know what to do in those moments. But I don't resonate with her in particular. But the faithfulness she displayed in her prayer and her strength is incredibly admirable to me. I love the story of Hannah because of her desire to continue to go to God with what's frustrating her. The Hebrew of this story is often very difficult to translate. I kind of brought that up a little bit earlier while I was reading. And I think most of the translations that we read do a pretty fair job of understanding what's going on here. But there is a sadness in this text that sometimes doesn't come through completely. Hannah is distraught. I mean, whatever the word is that you can think of she's at the end of her rope, that's the word that you should think about in your head right now, because that's the sense that the Hebrew is giving in this story. She, in this moment of her prayer, feels like she literally has nowhere else to turn and nowhere else to go. Some of this is due to her rival, this other wife of Elkanah. Some of it she is putting on herself, right? Again, defining herself by whether she has children or not. And then there's Elkanah and Eli, who have their own reactions to her plight. We have Elkanah saying something along the lines of, "Come on, what are children next to me?" Now, guys, I know you want to sympathize with Elkanah in that moment. I also want to as well, because I've said something similar to that, not about children, but about my wife's family. Come on, aren't I as good as your family? Why do you want to talk to them all the time? So I'm confessing to you this morning that I've been as petty as Elkanah was in this story. Yes, that probably doesn't surprise most of you, that I've been petty, but I have been. You read his reaction and you wonder, come on, dude, what are you doing? Why would you say that to her in this moment? It's almost as if he can't help himself. He's got to make it about him. He can think only of himself in that moment. And of course, he thinks that by saying that, he's going to make her feel better, but he's really just dumb. I mean, that's really what it is. It's a moment of stupidity for him. But that's equally true of Eli. He sees this woman praying, or at least I would assume he should think that she's praying, but instead he jumps right to, she's drunk. I mean, why? Clearly, he needs to go back to seminary and take some different counseling classes. Because this is not the way you start off with somebody. When you see them praying, they must be drunk. But did you catch later on in the text how it says that Eli is almost blind? You see, his vision, not just physically, but spiritually, is going as well. And that's why we're told in the text that hearing the word of the Lord and that visions in that time were very few. Eli, the high priest, the person who is supposed to be right closest to God, that's what everybody is, would think about him. He doesn't recognize God's voice, God's call on Samuel's life. He doesn't see this woman in despair and think good about her. He thinks she's drunk. You begin to see how Hannah has it so bad. Even the men in her life who should be on her side say ridiculous things. I admire her strength and her faithfulness through this difficult period. I want to end by talking about Samuel here. So we finally come to Samuel himself. And of course, again, wrapped up in Samuel is this person, Eli, who is the high priest at the time. The silence of God during this period is even pointed out by the author, right? It's so profound that God has not been heard during this time. I mean, it's palpable, right? As you read it, you can feel that God has been absent to these people, not because God has been absent, because they have not been listening. And you can wonder, why is the Lord so silent? But again, I think it comes down to the people and their choices to not hear the word of the Lord. Eli failed in his duty to be the high priest. He didn't raise his sons well. And in fact, there's a whole other story with them that we could talk about. We're not going to, but Eli failed in raising his own sons. He failed to, recognize Hannah's desperation in her prayer. And he failed to notice that God was calling out to Samuel. And ultimately, he fails in keeping the Ark of the Covenant safe. Eli's blindness in the story, again, isn't just about physical blindness. It is about his spiritual blindness as well. And that's where Samuel comes along and provides a great moment of triumph for the people because he truly has a good relationship with God. You see, Samuel becomes indispensable to God's plans. And the statement we saw in chapter 2, verse 26 here in 1 Samuel, about how he grew in favor with the people and with God, you probably recognize that from the Gospel of Luke, as that almost word for word is said about Jesus, right? Jesus comes along in the line of not Samuel from, physical lineage, but as a priest, as a prophet, as a ruler of God's people. He very much takes up that mantle that Samuel left behind so many years ago. Luke writes those same words about Jesus. And Samuel's placement in the story of God is so pivotal. He is so important as a transition guy. He's kind of the transition guy from judges to kingship. Because ultimately, Samuel gets to pick King David out of all his other brothers. Now, first there's Saul. I'm going to kind of kick that to the side. Saul didn't work out so well. But he got to pick David. And the statement in chapter 2 that we read, both in verses 11 and 26, there's so much around that. There's so much context there. But a couple of things are very important about that. Those statements, I think, fulfill two purposes. One, to articulate Samuel's legitimacy as the leader. Eli's going by the wayside. Who's going to take up the mantle of leadership in Israel? It's going to be Samuel. But then two, there also has to be some discrediting of Eli's household. Because he is the high priest at this time. And so Samuel has to take over, and Eli has to recede into the background. And then Samuel's great importance is seen in his response to the Lord. And I love it here. He's called 3 times, and he goes to Eli each time thinking, Eli will surely know what's going on here. He must be the one calling out to me. And every time Eli says, no, it's not me. I wonder what other words Eli says to him that we don't get here. Does he think Samuel's going crazy, maybe? Does he think he's just hearing something in his dream and imagining it, right? I wonder what Eli thought about Samuel in this moment. But Samuel responds in a very powerful way. Speak, for your servant is listening. And he says the words, here I am. Now, in Hebrew, that's one word, hineni, but it literally means, behold, I. He says, behold, I, meaning I am right here. And this becomes a common phrase for the other prophets to use throughout the life of Israel as they respond to the call of God in their lives. Behold, God, I am here. I am listening. Use me. That's what he's communicating. So little did Hannah know that her prayer would help shape the whole nation of Israel. Her prayer for a son changed the course of history. Because of her faithfulness, Samuel, like I said, would eventually find King David. Often we overlook the importance of women in Scripture, the importance of mothers and grandmothers. The story proves how important Hannah was to the story of God for His people. I hope that we too pray as earnestly as she did. Because as we started out with, prayer is a conversation. Prayer isn't just about getting what we want, right? We know that because all of us have prayed and not gotten what we wanted. I imagine sometimes that's due to the pettiness of our prayers. Sometimes it's just not what God has planned for us. Our earnestness, our faithfulness in prayer, our persistence in prayer, Jesus talks about, can be rewarded though. And it was for Hannah. Not because God has to answer every whim and desire that we have, but because prayer is that conversation. It leads us into a deeper and more intimate relationship with God. And so to conclude this morning, just a few things to take away from today. How should we rethink wholeness or completeness about ourselves in light of our relationship with God? What does it mean to be whole and complete? Are you relying on somebody else for your completeness in God? It's something we need to rethink about, something we need to talk about more often, and not define ourselves by each other or by other people. But do I have a relationship with God that is sustained because of that relationship? We've got to quit placing it on other things. Secondly, what role does prayer have in your spiritual life? Is it something that you're doing often, infrequently? And then ask yourself why. If your prayer life isn't where you think it should be or where you want it to be, ask yourself why. Why am I not praying more? And really delve deep there. Don't just ask why and then not answer the question. Answer that question and continue to probe deeper in yourself. Why is my prayer life not where it should be? And then the final thing is, are you ready to say, "Here I am," to the Lord? To whatever that may look like for you. Here I am. I mean, that's a big statement. That's a big statement. To think that God is calling you and say, "Okay, God, here I am." To not refuse that call, to not ignore that call, but to truly say, "Here I am." So this morning, we offer you that chance. If that call is on your life, if you feel like God has been asking you to do something for Him, you have the opportunity this morning to say, "Here I am, God. Use me. Do with me what you will." If you need prayers this morning from this church, we want to offer those on your behalf. We want to go to God for you this morning and pray about what's on your heart and your mind. If you have any need that you want to bring before us this morning, do so as we stand and sing.